This is Richard RJ Eskow. Kurt Cobain was not only arguably the greatest rock music talent of his generation, he was also, by all accounts, very politically progressive, very feminist, on the right side of the issues that most of the listeners of this program believe in. So what were we to make of a recent internet meme? I think it's come and gone a couple times, that says, I'm looking at it now, supposedly a quote from Kurt, in the end, I believe my generation will surprise everyone. We already know both political parties are playing both sides from the middle, and we'll elect a true outsider when we fully mature. I wouldn't be surprised if it's not a business tycoon who can't be bought and who does what's right for the people. Someone like Donald Trump, as crazy as it sounds, supposedly, according to this meme, and we know everything on social media is true, supposedly, according to this meme, Kurt Cobain said that in 1993. Well, I think that has been cleared up. That question has been cleared up by our next guest, my friend. He's been on the program before. Danny Goldberg is a former record company president and artist manager. He is the president of Gold Village Entertainment and the author, a longtime activist, and the author of a number of books, including his most recent, which we've discussed on this program, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and the hippie idea. He wrote about this recently in The Nation. So first of all, Danny, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's always great to talk to you, and particularly on this issue. You saw this meme, which I saw. Kurt or not Kurt?
No, it's completely made up. And somebody on the Spin Magazine website did a clever thing, which he Googled it to see if there was any reference to it prior to Trump's announcement for president, and of course there wasn't. It was just invented by somebody supporting him. It was on some Trump Facebook page called Trump Train during the election, and then for some reason a few weeks ago, I didn't notice it at that time, and then a few weeks ago it resurfaced and bouncing around on Twitter, and I got irritated enough to write something for The Nation about it. But he never said any such thing, nothing like it. It's completely made up out of whole cloth. In fact, Kurt was, Nirvana, I was one of the managers of Nirvana, and I was close to him personally, and I particularly was the person in his business world that talked to him about politics. I was the chairman of the Southern California ACLU at the time, and that was part of our relationship. And he never wanted Nirvana to be an overtly political band like Fugazi or the Dead Kennedys. He wanted Nirvana to be what it was, a mass appeal band with integrity and authenticity. But privately, he had politics that were progressive, and publicly he made his views clear on a number of issues. And he in '92, he called me one day excited. He had voted, he and Courtney Love, his wife, had made a contribution to Jerry Brown in the primaries in '92. When Brown didn't get the nomination and Bill Clinton did, Kurt voted for Bill Clinton. He told several journalists that he voted for Clinton. One of them asked him if he'd considered voting for Ross Perot, and he said absolutely not. He's a rich guy. He's an asshole. Kurt was also very committed to issues that you mentioned, feminism, gay rights. He hated bullies. He wrote about this a lot in the liner notes to Incesticide. At the end of it, he asked anybody who disrespected women or had any biases against people based on race or gender to please not come to their concerts, not buy their records. He was quoted as saying that he felt Republicans were evil inherently, or I think he compared them to Satan. He was a Democrat. And although he identified with people that were anarchists and was to the left of the Democratic Party on a lot of issues, which he said clearly, he understood that elections were about choices, and he was very clear about who he voted for and who he supported, and he never would have supported any Republican. He never would have liked anybody like Donald Trump, who was a bully and who was abusive to women. And, in the Little Nation piece I wrote last week, it quotes him several times to make that clear. So not the biggest issue in the world, but at a time when I think the right wing is doing what they can to create confusion and apathy and go after the kind of people who voted for Bernie, hoping that they'll hate both parties or be confused. I think it was worth setting the record straight. Kurt's legacy still means a lot to a lot of people, and his politics were quite clear.
Yeah, first of all, I agree that his legacy does still mean a lot to people, and I think he was a great artist. I think he was an extraordinary artist, and I think he had extraordinary sensitivity and awareness. So, and I've read some of his notebooks and so on, and some of his comments about politics. My impression of him was that he was the kind of person that you or I can relate to, in the sense that, in this specific sense, I mean, that he had a very clear vision of what society ought to look like, but in the meantime, you do what you can when it comes to politics, and that he was, passionate in his beliefs, but he knew sometimes you have to compromise to get something done. So I think he's.
Look, he was an artist first. He wasn't, like I said, he wasn't a preachy political artist, but his politics were quite clear, and he made them clear both in some of his lyrics and in his interviews. Chris Novoselic, who was also in Nirvana, remains an ardent activist. Sent me a note a couple of days ago saying, he agreed that this was a ridiculous notion. Chris is active in the Northwest, and believes a lot in electoral reform and changes in the system, but also supports, it certainly doesn't support any Republicans, because we understand that while there's a need for a lot of changes in the Democratic Party, and you've been a leader in that, there's no comparison. The worst Democrat is still better than the best Republican in terms of ethics and respect for minorities, women, gays, and other things, and that contrast become more stark lately. And I think it's just really important for people who are real radicals and critics of both parties to still be able to make short-term decisions to make sure that we don't drift into something even worse than what we have now.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a second, if you don't mind, Danny Goldberg, because even though it's a diversion from the Kurt topic, I always appreciate your insights on this. Here's my concern about the present political moment, because Trump is so vile and repulsive on a personal level. I get concerned about this, what I call, and I'm going off something that you just said. I get concerned about this. The anti-Trumpism that focuses singularly on just Trump as Trump. To me, I describe him over and over again as the id of the Republican Party. I don't think he's a deviation from what we've been seeing from these guys for 40, 50 years. I wrote a piece about the racism of the Republicans going back to the 1960s. So,
I completely agree with you about that.
Yeah, so, I think, to me, I worry about us just fixating on Trump's personal repellent nature and not enough. You said something about the worst, the Democrat being better than the best Republican. I think it's really important to make sure that everybody understands that not just Trump, but these guys are actually horrible.
Oh, well, I agree. I think there's two things in what you said. I think number one, I think I'm sorry, there's a beeping going on in the background. It'll stop in a minute.
No problem.
Number one, the Republicans as a party, especially since Nixon and especially since Reagan, have really represented a very different, narrower, more extreme ideology than whatever they meant before that. And the use of racism in their campaigns dates back to '64, when Goldwater campaigned in part against the Civil Rights Bill, and Nixon's Southern strategy, and Reagan starting his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights workers were murdered. George Bush Sr. using Willie Horton in ads, implying that African Americans were rapists and murderers. And we could go on and on. Beyond that, there are obviously important distinctions to be made within the Democratic Party. I'm a Bernie Democrat. I enthusiastically support him in the primaries. But when my Democrats don't win and a less appealing, more corporate Democrat is running against a Republican, I still support the Democrat, because the way the Congress is organized, the committee chairman, and the setting of the agenda on the floor of the houses is determined by the majority, and there's just no comparison, in terms of the mixed bag of the Democrats versus the monolithic extremism of the Republicans during this era. Maybe someday in our lifetime it'll change and we'll really have two parties to choose from, but right now we don't. We have to make the Democratic Party better, and we have to defeat Republicans if we want to avoid this drift. And I agree, it's not just Trump. Trump is the product of a philosophy, and he's an unusually effective and crude demagogue in mobilizing support for it, but he didn't create this philosophy. All these policies are from the Republican playbook going back some time.
Yeah, I completely agree, and you may not like this choice of words, but I like to fondly think of my ambition in politics as a sometimes hostile takeover of the Democratic Party. There are people who are going to resist it, but I think it's either going to become the party of real transformation or it's going to continue to struggle. So before we go, I can't help noting, you found a quote, Danny, in your piece that I can't help pointing out. First of all, you say there were times when Kurt gazed out at festival audiences and he saw the kind of kids who used to torment him as a teenager. Ivanka Trump is quoted in her mother, I don't know where you found it, is quoted in her mother's book, Raising Trump. Quote, during my punk phase in the 90s, I was really into Nirvana. My wardrobe consisted of ripped corduroy jeans and flannel shirts. I think Kurt would have hated being reduced to a fashion statement, don't you think?
Oh, well, at the time he did. He was very contemptuous of the whole notion of grunge as a trend. He didn't like being lumped in with anybody, even other Seattle artists. And he was aware that the brilliance and power of his music had taken Nirvana from being kind of a cult band that was very popular with this sort of alternative indie rock audience, which had a certain group of values, and became popular with the mass rock audience globally writ large because of just the sheer brilliance of the songs and the popularity that just sort of redefined what cool was. And, there were definitely some people that had been metal fans and just pop fans and trend followers who temporarily were Nirvana fans. And this really was something he thought about a lot, especially in terms of how people were about women, gays, and other things like that. And as after Nirvana's success, he became more outspoken on these issues because he wanted to make clear what he stood for and what the band stood for. At the same time, that's the great power of art and popular culture. It can change values subtly because people want to be cool, whatever that is. I think hip-hop did that. I think that there's a reason why the younger generation is so much more progressive than older generations. Part of it is the economics that they grew up with, but part of it, I think, is the culture they grew up with.
Yeah, I think that, and I love the thought that music can still change culture in this day and age.
It's not like didactic where one song
Right.
or one anthem just changes people's opinions. But I think in terms of values, the differing views about homosexuality and race among the younger generation is connected to the culture that they were exposed to growing up. I believe that.
Yeah, I believe that too. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But is it true what I hear that you're writing a book about Kurt Cobain?
Yes. The reason I found all these quotes so easily was because I just spent the last year researching it. I've handed in my first draft, waiting for some comments from my editor, which is Echo HarperCollins, and it's due to be published, I think, the second half of March of next year, around the time of the 25th anniversary of Kurt's death. It's called Serving the Servant, play on words about it, the song title of his, Remembering Kurt Cobain.
Well, we'll have to have you back on to talk about it when it comes out. But in the meantime, Danny Goldberg, president of Gold Village Entertainment, activist and writer, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks for everything you do to bring intelligence and principle to the political conversation.
Well, I appreciate that.